All right. Thank you all again. We are back. The Albert Wilson Foundation in Handy, South Florida is back to present you part 4 of our Unspoken series. This week's title is The Quiet Victim in the Room. So we have another great panelist lined up. We have Nicole Fisher. We have our great CEO of Handy, Kirk Brown, and Adama Ducille is back. So nice we had to have her twice. So we're back, and we're excited to hear our panel and have a great conversation around voicelessness in the Black community and the quiet victim, and how those in systemic power claim to be victims in certain situations. So without further ado, we want to dive in, and Kirk, if you don't mind, kind of give us your thoughts and background behind this topic, behind voicelessness and the quiet victim in the room. Why'd you want part 4 to be named this?
So part 4 comes from, first of all, my name is Kirk Brown. I'm the CEO of Handy Inc., a nonprofit in Broward County that services homeless foster care and relative care youth who've been through the dependency system. And our goal is to, achieve positive, lasting change for youth by providing life skills, education, and a supportive community to propel them into a bright future. So this topic, really sat on my conscience while watching what systemically goes on. I remember when I was a young professional around your age, Jamal, and I was sitting down in a room and they were discussing an issue and I had the solution, right? I just felt like I had the solution, so I said it. Said the solution, they were engaging everyone. So I said what I proposed to be the solution, and no one paid attention. Like, no one said anything. And then like a minute later, someone said the same solution, but they had a different color. So a white individual in the room said word for word what I said. And then everyone like zoned in on what that person said. And I remember immediately what went through my young professional mind was, I was upset. So I was about to say something. And then from across the room, an elder Black gentleman gave me the nod and the no communication, right? The nod and the no looks something like this. So immediately that was a full sentence, like, whatever you're thinking of doing right now, don't say it, I got you after the meeting, right? So I know the informal communication strategies that we exercise in these rooms and in these communities. And after that meeting, he pulled me aside and said, okay, listen, that happens. Here's how you treat it. Here's how you combat that. Here's how you get further with that. But I was still angry. I was still angry because my solution had value, because everybody in the room agreed with it, but it came out of the mouth of someone else. And the next time I found myself in the room, I just didn't speak. I didn't feel like speaking at all. So I wasn't of any value in the room because immediately my intellectual commodity didn't have value. My presence in the room didn't have value. And immediately I was the quiet victim in the room. And I've lived long enough and I've done this work long enough for 24 years to now see it happen 24 years later, where a person of color says the solution in the room and it goes around like they didn't say anything. And it's an acculturation syndrome, right? It's as if individuals in the room are socially programmed to not hear what this individual just proposed as a solution. So I think it's something we talk about a lot amongst ourselves. That's why it's called Unspoken, right? When Black people get together and we talk about the barbecue chat or whatever, we talk about, let me tell you what happened today. I literally told them what to do and nobody said anything about the solution I proposed.
Absolutely. I like that you mentioned that and that you started with this, just because early on in my career, and I'm still fairly early in my career, I would say that I've experienced those same things, but instead, I think it furthers that notion of voicelessness, because when I tried to bring it up to my direct report, my supervisor or the head of our department, it was always pushed on my age instead of addressing of like where it actually came from. Oh, well, just be patient, just kind of work your way in and like earn the right to speak, or I should say, or just pay your dues, instead of, when reality, you know why you're not being heard, you know. So it's just to continue to have it overshadowed, and just suppressed, or swept under the rug, because it's like, oh well, you just got here, or you're only 25, you know. So I think that it's important that you mentioned that and started the program off with that. So I think we have a great program ahead of us right now. So I'll jump right in with our first question, and Adama, feel free to chime in here. So what do you think is the reason for voicelessness, or where does voicelessness stem from?
I think, well, it's so multi-layered. If you think about it, you can, draw it as far back as slavery and post-slavery times. I mean, it really was a way of self-preservation for a lot of folks, in terms of knowing when and how you should communicate, as a Black person, as a person of color, in order to keep yourself alive. There was a lot of things that people had to endure, and really learn to face and not, voice the way you feel in that present moment. The question actually evoked a lot of thought for me, in terms of, I was a part of a group with the Southern Education Foundation, and we were all strategizing how we would approach a problem around inequalities in education for children of color. And it struck us that there were such stark differences in the way that the older members of the group went about answering the questions, and some of the younger members of the group went about answering the question. And when I kind of dived into it a little bit with some of my peers in the group, the older members, we found that a lot of it was based on what they learned, what their parents had said. There's certain things you don't talk about, you don't mention, other than at home, because you'll lose your life. I mean, a key and stark reference to this would be Emmett Till. If you read the Emmett Till story, and how, his family described the interaction between those youth, ranging in age from like 12 to 14, an interaction that was interpreted in a lot of different ways. The kids from the South knew not to speak, certain ways to certain people. But, Emmett being from Chicago, a whole different set of rules and guides and things that, dictated how you speak. It ended up with very tragic, unfortunately, outcomes for him. So that, history plays a part in it. When you look at the professional realm, you could stand to lose a lot if you say too much in certain, boardrooms or meeting rooms, to be easily troped as just that loud Black person in the room, the person that's just disgruntled and angry. A lot of times just differences of perspective. I think now what is happening in terms of a lot of the social injustice is really showing how things are not very, the same for folks of color and, and our white counterparts. We have very different experiences. Just look at police interaction in and of itself, for a lot of white people, police and interactions with police, bring forth feelings of safety and protection. And for people of color, especially Black people, it evokes a whole different level of emotion. So I think all of those play into, how we would go about answering that question. And then I think, Kirk, something that you bring up all the time, and I try to keep top of mind, is even as Black people, as we climb the social ladder and the professional ladder, there tends to be a moment where some people unfortunately lose a sense of consciousness, and you begin to distance yourself from certain behavior, certain actions, certain parts of your natural culture. So, I think the honesty around that too, and having to have those dual personalities, the person you can be at work and the person that you can be at home and with your friends. So all of those dynamics come to play in terms of, and it's not just, proper place and time. Because I know some people will, come back with, there's a time and place for everything. But I think parts of who we are as people of color do need to, be present, and we need to make sure that that space is there for that at work and also in other settings. So.
Absolutely. I want to circle back to that time and place component. I think that is huge. That's huge. We hear a lot of people say that, well, it's a time and place for everything, but how do we navigate that space? How long do you remain silent? When is the right time? If not now, then when? So I definitely want to circle back to that. Nicole, once again, pleasure to have you here. If you don't mind, briefly tell us more about your role, what you do with the organization that you work with, your title, and then feel free to answer the question, what do you think the reason behind voicelessness is?
Well, I know who I am, but that's a tough question. So, hi, I'm Nicole. My doctorate's in global public health, but my background's in neuroscience. So, I obsess over how people think and why and how they behave. And I run a small human rights firm in DC. And so, just, skipping through that and getting right into sort of the bulk of this, I think the two things that have really stood out to me thus far is when Kirk, said like he shuts down, he gets angry, and then hearing distance, that word, and I think a lot of what's happening here, you see it. It's a natural part of human behavior when people lose trust in a person, in a system, in anything, when they feel vulnerable, which means you feel taken advantage of, which is not heard, right? It's natural. You get angry. And what do you do when you get angry? You shut down. The things that are far away or distant become foreign to you. The things that are close become the things you really rally around. And it's really hard because that's when you should be using your voice the most. And yet it's when you don't want to. And so it creates sort of this vicious cycle, but it's a totally normal and natural reaction. And so, you've got to process why things are happening, how you feel, how to handle it. I like to be hopeful and think that we're reaching a place where people can have those honest conversations. But I don't know for sure. There are plenty of times in the last 10 plus years that something's happened and we've thought, we're finally going to have this conversation. And then everybody gets busy who has the ability, they're going to go back to work, they're going to focus on, the other things. And it was a nice to have conversation. So I'm actually in a place where I'm kind of hopeful, as weird as it may sound, that the pandemic is keeping people at home. And people are staying at a point mentally and emotionally and physically where they're frustrated. But by staying in this really uncomfortable place, I don't know, I think maybe it means a lot of the people who in the past haven't felt like they could have their voice heard now have like the momentum behind them, right? Like there's like an additive effect maybe of like, there are so many of us who are frustrated for different reasons, and people who need to be heard finally can, because there's a build-up effect.
Thank you, Kirk. I see you moving. It looks like you're burning up inside. Why do you think is the reason?
I think it goes a lot with the history of our socialization in America, right? To Adama's point, but it also has to do with a person's interaction and the value of their voice, right? The minute you realize that you don't have a value in a system, then the system itself is no longer valuable to you, right? So I think a lot of times our voicelessness, and when we say the word victim here, we're talking about both sides. We're not talking about the person in the room that's no longer speaking. We're talking about the room losing the value of the intellectual commodity that they could have gained from in that room, right? And now I hear a lot of people say, well, I'm listening to people now, and I always challenge them, have you really taken an analysis of yourself to say, oh my God, for the past 15 years, I lost a lot of intellectual commodity in my company, in my socialization with others, because I'm finally listening. So I think that's one. I think the other part and I love how Adama talks about the elders and how the elders' reaction to the situation is different than the younger people in the group, because we're tired. That fatigue sets in, and I always equate it to you're in a room yelling, and it's like a silent scream, right? Literally, and there comes a time where when you've done this for 22, 23, year after year after year, and then you realize you get to that place where fatigue kicks in. And I think I've talked to a lot of elders. I had an experience with a quiet Black old man who taught me something that I wrote into, kind of a constructional poem about why are our elders so quiet? We seem to be trying to pull the information out of them. And for them, it was life and death. And now for us, it's, in access to opportunities, locked out of conversations, locked out of planning situations, right? Because the lynching for speaking out now is opportunities to taking away off. So we really have to really make that leap to kind of like really understand that the voicelessness for a certain age group now is because they're tired, they're exhausted. And I think that's why now you see some people in rooms that you got to ask them 3 times, exactly what do you think about this? Because they've given their information before and nothing happened, and they watch others give the same information and everything happens.
Absolutely. That leads right into our next thing and what we took notes on about being voluntary quiet. So Adam, would you like to expound upon that? Is there such thing as voluntary quiet? Are we just tired of speaking up and having our voices fall on deaf ears? Would you like to expound on that?
Voluntary. I think it all is in the same is in the same vein of what we've been talking about. I think when we spoke earlier, as part of the preliminary conversation, we did talk about it falling on deaf ears, and that's something that has a big question mark, on it. I think a lot of it's not even that it falls in deaf ears, but intentionally it's ignored because for a variety of different reasons. One is lack of perspective, and a lot of it is just written off as that's not my experience, so there has to be some untruth to it. And I think a lot of people of color get very tired of defending their experiences because immediately someone wants to write it off, and most times write it off in the favor of the person who has wronged you, in some way, or some discrimination you faced, or blatant racism that you faced. To be constantly told that, or have your story retold so that you can understand it better. Your experience in the store, your experience when you went to go drop your resume off and something wasn't right. So I think just people having their experiences constantly questioned and retold gets tiring. So that, that fatigue over time. And I think another big part of it comes with, a lack of sharing power. Because once someone acknowledges that the things that you are saying is real, then comes the onus of having to do something about it. So I think that has a lot to, do. I think it's not just deaf ears. I think it's just a matter of not wanting to address and really deal with the things at hand. I've had a lot of interesting conversations with white peers and white coworkers and white colleagues, and just to hear how much of what had gone on in my world, in my reality, they were kind of completely oblivious to. It was shocking. So I think that for me, is the root of it.
So wait, Adama. So it's like you said to someone, I got hit by a car, and they're like, I needed you to give me an example.
I need the example. In most cases, it will be maybe he didn't see you. That really wasn't the case. Or I've had that happen to me too. It's always the writing off of the experience in some way, shape, or form, where what happened to you was not, is not validated. It's just the opposite of what you presented to me. And it can start to mess with your psyche. I think until we've all had these check-ins with each other. Like, did you just see that? Or did you hear that? Or did that really happen? Or as most people know, especially people of color, the looks that we give each other across the room in the meetings that we're like, okay, that was a little off. But if you voice it, that you'll get that pushback. And I think that pushback, and which comes in a lot of different forms, is what people just, the atrophy starts to happen and you just don't want to have to continue to defend yourself anymore.
I want to stay right there with what you mentioned about being not just falling on deaf ears, but being intentionally ignored. So, Nicole, in your role, in your line of work, how have you seen voicelessness in the Black community as it relates to healthcare? I'm not sure if you've seen some of our previous panels, but healthcare has come up a lot. And we notice the statistics as it pertains to Black women and pregnancy and other things, and the different voices and concerns that we've heard in the topics we discuss as it relates, not only just to Black women, but to the Black community in general in healthcare. How have you seen voicelessness in the Black community?
Sure. Well, one, I'll just say, I don't use my personal experiences very often. My better half is very off the record. He doesn't do social and whatnot. But, as you were saying that, it really made me think like that, falling on deaf ears and those who just don't want to hear the message. I'm clearly white and my husband is not. And I remember having those conversations about like even just getting like pulled over and those experiences. And I have, the ability in that situation to know the heart of where, like, say my parents are coming from or my grandparents, right? I've known them my whole life. And yet when I describe his experiences, it's very obvious. Like there are some people who are just like, no, there's always an excuse. Well, what, he must have been speedy. He must have, right? Now that they know him and now that it's the process of having grandchildren, they know his heart, they know where and now it's a different conversation. And so I want to, just sort of validate like they're two different things that are going on there. There are people who it seems impossible to some of us, but they really don't know. Like it somehow we made it to 2020 and they hear these stories and they're still just like, well, but until they can relate it to somebody they know and love, or it just doesn't sit in the same way. And it baffles me and we live it, but those people do still exist. Others don't want to hear. And that's a whole different battle. Right. And so anyway, that, having your lived experiences invalidated, like I'm just adjacent to it constantly. And I can't imagine how hard that constantly, and tired. I think tired is the word. And I often ask my friends and, family, how are you feeling? Tired. I think that's actually probably the most common word I hear right now. I think that's a very just valid feeling. People are tired and that's okay. So as for the healthcare lens, I think it comes back to the word that was sort of touched on earlier, which is trust. I mean, there are plenty of reasons that people don't trust the system, particularly the healthcare system. I mean, anyone over the age of 60 has lived experiences in which they should not trust the system. And we've got this whole other thing going on now that takes all the inequalities, all the problems, and it's just exacerbated them. I mean, people who could overlook a lot of issues in the past when it comes to healthcare in particular, you can't ignore them now. I mean, they're blatantly obvious. And so I think it's still going to take longer. It's going to take another generation and it's going to take change. I mean, the way our grandparents feel about the healthcare system and they have every right to feel that way, and nothing's going to change in the next few years. And we don't know how, and I'm not going to put it on politics, but we don't know what the next couple of years are going to look like. And it's going to be really hard for everyone, but for communities of color, it's going to be extra hard because the messaging is going to be mixed. The trust in the system isn't there. The way, even if we had a vaccine, the way that stuff's going to roll out, it's not going to be equal depending on who we've got representing us in our communities. It's going to be a really tough couple of years ahead of us. And so I think this conversation about voice is so important, because now is the time that speaking up is it really matters. I know everybody's tired, but I think now we're at a place of a real opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kirk, this next question. So I see we're not living in the dark. We all can cut on the TV, we can go on our social media, and we just seen that another innocent Black man was murdered, shot 7 times in the back. Jacob Blake, say his name. Justice for Jacob. So Kirk, my next question for you, as well as for the entire panel, what is the value of my voice when society doesn't even value my life? Would you like to be the first to take a stab at that? Also, before you do that, Facebook, if you have any questions, feel free to chime in the chat box as well.
Wow. I would like to say that we don't need a dissertation to prove our pain. For those people who constantly ask for examples on, lived experiences, remember when you ask that person for the example, they're reliving their trauma. So we don't need a dissertation to prove to you that we have pain, because you don't need one to prove to me that you have pain. The value of my voice when they don't value my life, the value of my voice is even more important now because you don't value my life. I have to teach my kids about the fact that my voice is important, right? I have to build a foundation, and for all of us, that our voice, although we're devalued in many different ways, is a component given to us by God. It's not given to us by man. So man can't take it. It's ours. So never put the value of what you have to say, what is coming from your soul and your heart, in the hands of a system, a political leader, or even a preacher. Put a value on that from you and to your God, because at the end of the day, your value for your voice, you're the main component of that value. We tell our young people at Handy all the time, say it, don't leave it in. Let it out. You might use the wrong word. Let's be frank, because right now, when I think about everything that's going on, I have some words I can't repeat on Facebook Live. I'm just saying, right, that I've said just walking by the television on the morning news, and I just find myself arguing with my TV now, right? So at some juncture, we have to realize that our voice in rooms of darkness, and I have to tell you, the rooms of darkness is where your voice needs to be in. It's not the rooms where everybody's agreeing with us and we locking elbows and singing Kumbaya like we solved the problem. It's a room where people don't understand or refuse to act that our voices need to be in. Change doesn't come from all of us agreeing. We all, if you're preaching to the choir, it doesn't solve anything. So our voices in rooms of darkness are more beneficial than anything else. So the fact that you don't value my life is gonna make me speak louder. And I had a candid conversation last week with someone that we agree that stupid is winning. Like, people have some of the craziest things to say and they're speaking louder than we are. We need to combat that symptomology in our society. So we need to speak louder than the stupid that's winning, because they're speaking loud. That's just my 2 cents.
I don't know, Jamal, if I can have a second, because there was something that Nicole touched on that really struck me when she talked about trust, and with this topic. And I think a lot of times people are, exercising. I have something else to say about when we don't exercise our power and our voice. But I think a lot of times people are sharing, the ways that they're feeling and the things that are happening. And when it comes to trust, with trust comes a great deal of responsibility, and where's the other side, of the story, and holding people accountable when you do put your trust in them to do the right thing. And I think the last panel we were on, we briefly touched on Shalon Irving and her story, the CDC epidemiologist who, 3 weeks after giving birth to her daughter, died from the thing that she was studying. You can't have a clearer case than putting your trust in the healthcare system, putting your trust in the people that need to be protecting you when you're in a vulnerable position, using your voice, and then having it, not work out in your favor in the most detrimental way. So I think on both sides, the voicelessness of the people who hear the message and don't say anything, that side of it.
And Jamal, can I add something? I think our voices need to go from being hashtags and signs and slogans to being policy.
Yeah.
Our voices need to be in policy. Our voices need to be in city codes. Our voices need to be in ordinances. We could come up with some of the coolest hashtags. We could design a whole bunch of great t-shirts, but we need to start designing some policies. We need to start designing some ordinances, right? Because that voice is not just vocal. It represents who we are as a nation. So, trust me, other voices are going into policy.
So I just want to add on. So I think that's 100% right. In terms of, we often conflate politics and policy, but it's policy. It's housing policy. It's transit. It's education. It's food. It's water. Those at the end of the day are healthcare. The system, the hospital we go to, that's the end product, right? When we get sick, when something goes wrong. Policy is what determines access and who has the ability to get to something. I mean, in Chicago, there are people who have to take 3 buses to get to a hospital. There's no way you can argue that there's equality there in any way, right? There are other hospitals in Chicago who charge $75 to park in the garage. We know who's going there. Right? We won't name names. So I think policy is the key, but yeah, I do think trust is a big part of that conversation. And trust looks like a lot of different things.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for the now, going back to those environments that we're currently in, or the differences between the generations and how we process and handle things, how should someone handle not being heard right now? What are some solutions right now for someone's current role? Adam, I see you nodding your head. You want to take a stab?
It's just such a good question, and I think my initial answer is making it a formal process, because I think we all do, like we've acknowledged, sit in those rooms and have those moments. Just making it formal, sitting down with if it's a work setting, sitting down with your supervisor or your peer, and finding a way to express exactly what happened in your own terms. A lot of times it really, those things, as Kirk mentioned, are detrimental to our professional growth. Like we end up being really stagnant and seeing the things that we say flourish and thrive and become whole policies and practices and programs where we work, and you seeded that, but unfortunately you never got the recognition for it. So really just taking action and sitting down and making sure that there's a formal record of how you feel. And you can do that without, offending anybody. It's not an HR thing. I say start, first with the acknowledgement of the person that should be working for you, which is, your direct supervisor. And the second thing is really finding that peer within that setting that you can bounce things off of, because it really can, again, start to gnaw at your psyche and your inner spirit to constantly be just missing in the room and invisible. And you almost start to, to doubt and question yourself, is this really happening? So really getting that sense of validation is very cathartic. You can start to decompress and get some of that frustration and anger out. But don't let it go, too long unaddressed.
I'd like to follow up on that. Both things you said. I think the first, even hearing you say that, it made me even more tired, just in the sense of being proactive and having a formal, right, that's right. And yet it's that's a whole nother job. It's you've got your job, you got to think about protecting your job, and then you've got to think about how to create a message and find the ad, like that's a lot of extra work. And so I think it's the right way. I think you're right, but I think it also, I mean, the question, if I'm not mistaken, was like how to, like how do you, I mean, you've got to be prepared that you're taking on a whole extra thing. It's not just like, oh, this is an additive part of my job. Like it's a whole second job, trying to make your job understand where you are in your life. And change is hard, and then they're going to push back, right? Because nobody likes change. And then I think that when you're talking about like peers and outlets, I think that's important too. And I would then just add, I think collectively we have to understand, and I'll actually look at some of the other places I've worked quickly, just saying like, when we see people in other places like taking to the streets, we just saw it with like Hong Kong, right? We're like, yes, look at them out there. They deserve to have a voice free from, China. But then all of a sudden it's like people are in the streets here and you see people being like, that's wholly unacceptable. You can't, it's just, we have to understand that people reach a point that by the time people act out, the anger, the frustration, the not being heard, those things have spilled over. That is a natural result of how people get treated. And I think right now, my perspective, I can only speak for me, but like we seem to be in this weird place where the country like does not recognize how either disingenuous or like the cognitive dissonance that exists. Like it's okay when we see it somewhere else, but not here. Like we, as opposed to internalizing it, like, wow, this means the spillover is showing us what should have happened 10 steps ago. It's like, whoa. And it's very strange, but all I can think of is it's again, it just comes back to people are okay when it's over there, when you're having a conversation about what's going on with somebody else. When it hits home in your own street, everything they said, they don't behave in the same way. And so, a lot of people are having a really hard time and they're not doing well with their own being disingenuous. We'll just say that.
Kirk, jump in. I see you over there.
How should someone handle not being heard? So I really love the last two pieces of knowledge that I got from the ladies here. Again, Nicole, yes, there's a lot of people that have tortured souls right now because of, a long-term acceptance of cognitive dissonance, right? Like they're like, oh my God, I don't know what to do with this because it appears to be true. But I use the example of being in the room later on where a person of color proposed a solution. I decided that room was not going to move forward until we acknowledged that the person said something. I've seen it happen with people of color. I've seen it happen with women. I've seen it happen with the elderly, right? And I have literally, no matter what someone says next, I bring it back to the fact that that person said something. That person, gave something in our society that we're going to acknowledge before we go on, right? And I've done it in a wonderful professional way. Like, I let the other person finish what they're saying. And then I'm like, hey, Adama, I thought I just heard you say something. Can you repeat that for me? Because I don't think everyone else heard it. And then when she says it, I let everyone acknowledge that they heard it. And then invite feedback from that. Because when someone in the room stands up for your voicelessness and brings you back, then I think that's when people start believing in the system, right? That's when people start believing for the people that's in that room together. And, challenge the perception that we're just gonna go to the next thing without even addressing it. No, we're not going to go to the next thing. We're going to address this. I think that's one of the ways to do it, but do it in a way, I was talking to my wife earlier and she was like, well, tell the person to take a deep breath first. Because that fatigue that we just talked about earlier, right, is what gets us the angry Black man in the room or the angry Black woman in the room, naming, right? So take that deep breath, breathe through it, and then address it, because anger solves nothing. It really doesn't. Challenging your anger in an intellectual way solves problems, right? So you got to be thinking through your anger in order to solve the problem. So for me, is think this through, when you feel like you're not being heard, and, get your allies. Get your allies to repeat what you said. Get your allies in the room to make sure you're heard also, and make sure your allies are heard.
And Jamal, if I could add to that, because there was another piece for me, which is coming with a solution. I always feel it's beneficial when you have to address a problem to address it with a solution. And just how can the change be made? You know what I mean? How can that space be made for you? And assure the next time, if it's at every meeting, you just make sure that everyone at the table adds into whatever the discussion is that can become a part of the basic practice. And what comes to mind as an example is, and I can't remember if this was last year or the year before, some of those crazy Gucci ads that went out with the young child in the monkey sweater, and had they just done a little round robin, because I'm sure someone of color had to be at the table with, is this the right thing to put out, right? Does this really represent how our brand, views children and individuals? Or someone to just say, hey, this will be triggering, like someone's going to see this and have, it's going to evoke an emotion. So I think coming solution focused and always just presenting a way that the issue of not feeling heard and being seen in a room can change for you is powerful.
The example that comes to mind of what Kirk was just saying as well, I remember, I think someone ended up writing about it, maybe in the Atlantic or so, I don't remember. Somebody wrote about it, but it was an active, intentional thing that women in the last administration did. And there are 4 women in particular in Obama's sort of smaller circle, and they would amplify, and they would actually kind of get together, and they knew what they were going to talk about. And they made it very intentional in meetings where if a woman said, well, I think, and then they moved the conversation, one of the other women at the table would use the name and the topic. And that was how they'd be like, well, I heard Kirk say this, could you, or, well, when Kirk mentioned, and they would do that throughout meetings so that they were constantly making sure that the woman's name and her idea was being said over and over, so that by the time people left the room, even if they wanted to just, think whoever, we came up with the idea, they had heard multiple times who the person was that planted the idea. And I just thought that was such a great way for, before the meeting started, they didn't know what they were going to talk about per se, but they'd say like, I want to make sure you're heard. And they were very intentional about it.
Absolutely. Great points. Great points from everybody. Another thing that we like to touch on here, going back to Adama's point with solutions, how can allies help? What is the importance of allyship when it comes to the quiet victim or voicelessness? Open question to anybody want to take a stab at that first.
Okay, so I think first of all, to our corporate community and even big organizations, enlist opinions from everyone in the room. It's so simple. Make it that people talk in the room. I think it's very essential that you leave the door open for everyone to be able to speak, and make sure everyone, contributes to the conversation, because back to Adama's example, I'm almost certain someone in that room was like, right? So, it's very valuable.
That look happened across the table, like, oh, this is not going to be good.
not going to be good. But, you know, and in addition to that, I want us to also think about the victimization of society, right? So for the ally in the room, also understands the impact of only gaining 50% of the intellectual commodity that's in that room. Your company is losing. Your community is losing. Imagine how much greater it could be if you had all of the intelligence that's in that room, right? If that's not a driving force, right? If that's not a driving force for you to support, but in addition to that, check your friends who shut people up in the middle of them, you know, giving or inheriting their voice, because it's hard enough to speak already right now because we're so tired. We're really tired as a society, right? So check your friends who shut people down at the door. I think, you know, allies play a great role that you could look across at someone and say no. Because I know the look also, Adama, when we tell our colleagues, you know, culturally to no, like, no, don't do that. Like it's a look, and we all know the look. So allies can also assist with that. Check the person that you know specializing in silence in the Black community.
So, Kirk, do you believe that the privileged must speak on the plight of the oppressed?
Oh man, oh man. Well, that was a good one. Like you asked me a PhD question on Facebook Live. Okay, yes, I do believe the privileged should speak on it's a job of the privileged to speak on the sides of the oppressed, because you're as powerful as the words that you use to uplift mankind. You're as powerful as the words that you use to uplift mankind. So you can't say you have power without exercising humility and uplifting mankind. So I think it's our job to speak on the oppressed. I think it's our job to really call out injustice. If you have any kind of privilege, right? So I'm a Black male. I know I'm privileged as a male. So I speak up every single time I see injustice when it comes to women, right? I check guys in my circle, right? I check people from an injustice standpoint. I think it's time that the privileged exercise its voice and the oppressed not be quiet.
So I will have to, I don't disagree with what Kirk said, but I think it really is the place of the privilege to give a platform. Everyone should have the ability to tell their own story. You know, no one can tell my story and my experience better than me. And I think as a part of sharing that power and showing that I am your for me to have the opportunity use your power to create platforms for others.
We kind of lost you for a second, in and out, but I think we got the gist of it. But
I think what Adamo was saying is it's the privilege needs to use their privilege and opportunity to develop platforms for the oppressed to express themselves to society, because the oppressed has a voice of their own, right? And they could speak for themselves. So you have the ability to open the door, so the oppressed can walk through and speak on their own, because there's this thing, it's this either or syndrome that we have, right? You're privileged or you're not. And when you really look at it, the oppressed have so much value, and the oppressed themselves can speak for themselves. I hope I articulated exactly what Adamo was saying before, the internet took it over.
no, it's great. I think you did great, and I appreciate that input. Nicole, I saw you nodding your head a lot and smiling and moving around. Would you like to add that? Is it a responsibility of the privileged to speak on behalf of the oppressed? Or feel free to chime in based on what else you've heard.
Sure. So I mean, I think the word that I think registered the most was platform, which is nobody here needs me to speak on their behalf. If I happen to be able to open a door, I will happily let you walk through it, right? That is my job if I can, have one. But you don't need me speaking on your behalf because one, I'm not going to tell the story right. Two, it's not going to be as genuine, authentic. It's not going to be what's needed. I don't have your ideas. I don't have your experiences. I think we're in a place. So when Kirk actually started his part of that answer, he also spoke to the business argument, which I think is one that there's a real place that a lot of people who are, however you want to term an ally, right? If the place you work, if the whatever it is you do for a living, who you work with, if people around you aren't making change out of their moral compass pointing the right direction, I mean, just out of like basic human decency, there are plenty of business arguments to be made as to why you need these voices, all these opinions. And I mean, the example was a great one. Like, I have a really hard time imagining the room of individuals that made that sweatshirt and thought of that ad and went, that's it. That's going to sell a lot of sweatshirts. Like, what? That it doesn't even make sense, right? And so I think the other thing here that we've kind of touched on a few times now is either or. Someone just said that, like, either, that's kind of where we are. I mean, we're people. So at the end of the day, we're all kind of simple. We like very distinct things. We run to our corners, for better or worse. People right now are, the word that's been used, they're tired. They're cognitively tired. People are stressed. They're angry. When you ask a lot of people, I'm not saying it's right, but when you ask a lot of people to think 2-3 steps down, that's just too much. It's so much easier to be like, it's this or it's this. Pick one or the other. It's all you got to do. And that's simple. Simple is easy. And so when you have a platform to give other people voices, you need to share that, because otherwise people are going to be like, oh, it's just this. And they're going to stick to their either or. But if you open that door and they already trust you, they inherently have trust in this new voice, this new perspective. And I mean, I can tell you, my in-laws, they don't want me to speak for them either. My sister-in-law has a voice all her own. So it's really, I think platform was such a wonderful word, of whatever it is, big, small, in your church, on Twitter, whatever it is. If you've got it, you've got people that trust you, you've got a community, give somebody else that platform.
Absolutely. I had a couple of things come to mind just listening to those things, and one thing is my mind went back to something that Kirk said earlier, and I saw a comment in the Facebook chat about having a seat at the table. So if people of color and those don't have a seat at the table, but our white counterparts do, does that tie into what you mentioned about sharing that platform? Or is that still considered speaking on behalf of somebody? Because if they're not in the room, how can their voice be heard? How can those concerns be heard? Is that necessarily speaking on behalf of somebody, or that's just taking advantage of the room that you're in, the table that you're at, if we don't have a seat at the table? Loaded question, but
really loaded question. I mean, I guess I can only speak for me, but I'm not one of those people that needs the attention per se. So like, I have no problem saying my friend Lauren should have a seat. Now she can answer that better than I can. I don't need to be there. I don't know that everyone feels that way. I think people like to be heard, as we're talking about. And so I think giving up power or voice or FaceTime, whatever it is, I think that's really difficult for a lot of people. But I think if you're going to act as though you are claiming to speak, then yeah, there's absolutely no problem in saying, I'm not the person you need for that. You need this other person. And then you make a recommendation. You provide a person. We've seen this done a little bit. Again, I can only speak to certain aspects of different communities in health, but like I've turned down plenty of speaking opportunities because it was me and 4 men. And they asked me to come in and be like the moderator. And I'm like, I'm not here to be the showgirl. If you can, I know 2 women who should totally be on this panel. If you want them, great. I know 2 people of color who should speak to that, not me. But I think for so many people are trying to climb, that's really hard, I think, for a lot of people to do that, which it shouldn't be, because we should, again, any platform we have, we should be giving to others.
Absolutely. Adama, you're back. I saw you nodding your head. You had something to chime in.
I know it's such a good question. The thing that came to mind is there's nowhere in this country that you can look around and see one type of person. So all the tables should be representative of where you are. So just most simply use that opportunity to create, make the inside look like the outside.
I go before the table though, Adama. Like, I've walked in the rooms and I've literally asked, how in God's name everybody look the same in here? Like, seriously, like, how is this even possible? And, it's time to stop taking the same excuses. It really is. Like, you couldn't find 2 more? Like, really? Like, we really have to call it what it is. You deliberately had 10 men at the table. You deliberately had 9 white people at the table and 1 black guy, right? There's no way you told me you fashioned the table this way and thought it would be productive without including anyone else. You can't have an inclusivity and diversity mission and only have 1 person, right? So I think it's time we start questioning the tables. Like, how productive is that table? Because it's great, we start focusing on the seats, but how productive is that table if everybody looks the same and thinks the same? Really? Right?
Not.
So we really have to start going to a place where we question the validity and the value of the table that lacks diversity.
I agree. I'm with you. And to your point, we have conversations offline all the time about how it's not enough just for in the heat of the moment, heat of the battle, that a company puts out a statement and then next thing you know, a few weeks later, they hire someone as a chief diversity officer or a manager of diversity and inclusion. And I would take it a step further, that going back to your point of challenging the tables and challenging these organizations, it's not enough to just put 1 person in that role if you're not putting the team and the resources around that for that person to succeed. D&I isn't just a small project or a small task that you should just put on 1 person, or else we're going to be having the same conversations a few months later about being exhausted and being tired, or a point that Nicole Fisher made earlier about having work on top of your work or a job within the job. But I think it goes along with being intentionally ignored as well. It's just something to do to kind of pacify the moment. I know Kirk and I talk about that all the time. But that's truly where I feel like we're doing a disservice to those people, those individuals that we put in those roles. But along with trying to climb the ladder, a lot of people take advantage of those things, and it's good. It's a lot of space that could be done, but how successful can you be in certain situations?
I think just to follow that up, as you were saying that, it made me think I did a code switch episode on NPR not too long ago, and we were talking, the episode was called Why Now, White People? And we were having a conversation about why now. And one of the things that came up was basically, putting out a statement. And I was like, honestly, until the pandemic started, I didn't realize how many listservs I was on. I didn't know how many companies had my email address until every single one of them told me their COVID-19 strategy and plan. And then like 2 weeks later, it felt like I got the exact same email except it said Black Lives Matter instead of a pandemic or virus. And it was just like these blanket statements of like, we're here, we care, we're thinking about this. We want you to know, as our loyal customer, we're thinking about this. And it felt so like, it really just felt like it was like a copy paste. Like, this is our corporate good. This is our corporate action. We're just appeasing the moment. And so we were having that conversation about like, what's the actual action? So you subbed in some words, you sent out the email, but like what's actually happening? Is the table being rearranged? Has the table been turned over? Did we go to a different room? Did we just walk away from that table? We just went to a restaurant down the street and started a new table. I don't know. But it really struck me. For me, it was just that like reading these emails and being like, holy shit, I just read that email 2 weeks ago, except you said it was just a pacifying measure, as you just said, or at least it felt that way from a lot of companies.
And at the same time, though, I realize how difficult is to write that statement, right? So
sure, and I don't want to.
Imagine being the guy who gets
I don't want to take away credit from people who are genuinely interested, authentically trying. I was just acknowledging that the pacification has to be recognized.
Yeah, but I agree with you. But can you imagine being the guy who gets the task of writing a statement and you're like, oh my God, like, what do I write? And I think this really goes back to that value of the voice. What do I write to cover the last 20 years? Like, for real.
It's a great word too, in terms of value. You really do. Nicole said something that really struck me, and that was, I'm talking about people's moral compass and humanity and dignity. And I think a lot of this, I mean, the piece that makes racism so tricky, right, and so elusive to really put your finger on sometimes is what happened from the very beginning of it. Because in order for people to do what they did to the indigenous folks, to do what they've done to Black people, to do what they've done to the Aborigines, is you had to dehumanize them. Because if you had morals and you had ethics, there's no way that you could do what you do. So you have to take those strip people down, and make them not like you in order to, victimize and brutalize them. So that goes back to where we are now. That goes back to why you can sit at a table and people don't see you, because you've been so stripped for generations of your value that when you speak, it's like, I mean, people are ingrained. As Nicole said, when you told the experiences of your husband, we can rail off 1,000 reasons why he got pulled over without any, conscious, knowledge of wanting to do harm. But the biases are so deeply planted in our brains, and we all act from them. So that getting to a place where we see people as human beings is really the first hill to to climb.
I think, can you hear me, Jamal? Did I freeze? No?
I can hear you.
I think I can't go further without mentioning the NBA. And I think the statement that's being made there, is if you really want to gain the value of those lives, you now have to value the voice. Right? So I think, Adama, the moral compass and all of those other things, we place we are a great value in society. America is great because of the people in it, right? And if you want to continue to gain the value of the people in it, it's now. You can't pass go. You have to value the voices now.
Or stop, going from the vantage point of exploiting people's value for your own good.
And that's what, when you were just talking about that, I was thinking like, when you bring up sport, like it's entertainment to so many people, and it gets back to that valuing of life, not just entertainment, the thing that you do at night on the weekend. Everyone it's a human life with an equal voice, but you have to humanize that voice.
Wow. I'll say I couldn't have said it better, and I think that's a great way to end this session. Just humanizing the voice and the value of the voice across all platforms, and we're living in an interesting time right now, and I commend the people who are stepping up, especially those guys in sport, but then people across the country as well who aren't being showed, who don't work in the entertainment space, who are stepping up and using their voice. Go ahead, Adama. I see.
Yeah, you you reminded me of one other thing that I wanted to say. This has been such a great conversation, and if we all bring it back to the civil rights movement, when people thought that there wouldn't be change, like that bus boycott, when people started digging in folks' pockets, and really the economic value of folks started to weigh on the great state of Alabama, change happened. Change happens when you collectively, push your power. So it's really great, as you said, to see what the NBA players are doing, because that really is going to be digging in a lot of people's deep pockets by, making this.
And to what you said earlier about, making, I don't think you explicitly said making people uncomfortable, but, if you're the only one in the room who has a voice in a certain way, you got to speak it. But I mean, when you look back on, like, I forget, it was right after the passing of John Lewis, someone, maybe it was the New York Times or something, released all these polls that came out when it happened. And it was like 22% of America or something like that supported what was happening at the time. But now, all of a sudden, everybody's got an Instagram picture and a quote. But at the time, it was, I really think, if I remember looking, it was 22% supported what was happening. So they didn't want to hear their voice. They didn't want to have to listen to what was going on. They didn't agree with it. And now here we are. So, use your voice, because it may not be popular now, but you may sit in the rotunda of the Capitol in 60 years from now.
Right, absolutely. Kirk, I know you shared earlier a poem that you wrote a while back, in addition to the final thoughts that we've had and the solutions that we offer.
I'm having some technical.
Uh-oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. So final thoughts.
Yeah.
So final thoughts. So for those of us who have ran long distance races, right? Those wonderful half marathons, 13.1 or the 26.2. We know when we get to that 0.1 or that 0.2 is usually the longest 0.1 or 0.2 we have ever done, because we're so tired. And that's when your brain starts asking you questions like, why are you out here? You paid to do this? Like literally, your brain gives you reasons to quit. And I feel that's the way voicelessness is for us right now. We're on that point too. We're on the last leg of this thing. So we're gonna have to push through for what we would like to say is the longest 200 meters we'll ever have to run. But don't be quiet in this point too. Yell all the way to the finish line. For those who are listening, for my handy kids that are listening, for the handy family that's listening, we're going to yell all the way to the finish line so our children don't have this discussion. So this is in the history book, and our children don't have to have the discussion we're having now. We can't make this history if we relive it all the time. So we can't be quiet.
Then I would like to follow that, just saying, to your point about policy. So like with the Albert Wilson Foundation, right? Like when we're talking about kids in the foster system, when we talk about kids who touch our juvenile justice system, food insecurity, housing insecurity, if we don't want this kind of thing to continue, yes, you have to use your voice, but part of that is making sure that we change policy, because until we make sure that kids have homes, kids are fed, they're given an education, they feel safe, they're not gonna have a voice. And so use your voice, but it's not just politics. It's not just hating, who's making the loud noise on social media or in the White House at the moment. It's policy change that has to happen. And a lot of that is local. It's your community. It's holding, your city council people accountable, your state, federal. It's all of that.
Absolutely. Adama, did you have any final words?
I have one final word is vote. We had 1 million people registered in Broward, only 300,000 showed up. And if you talk about why we are voiceless because we are voteless sometimes. We got to get out and exercise our right to vote. People died for us to do it. It really is profound, that we can do this here in this country. Vote.
Vote, absolutely. Absolutely. My final words, I was going to try to save it for later, but it's a quote that I live by. It says, the same shade tree you plant today, you'll never cool under. So when you think about trees and the process of how plants grow and how long it takes for that big tree that we pass by every day to get to where it is now, it didn't just grow and get there overnight. So to echo those sentiments of Kirk and to the youth that are watching or may go back and listen to this later, and everybody, vote, continue to use your voice and see the value in your voice. And things aren't going to happen overnight. Things may not happen in the next few months or next year. But if you think about those who came before us, I think about Congressman John Lewis before he passed, and he said, if you think no progress has been made, try walking in my shoes. You think about the things that he endured and those that during that time endured. They never saw that we would be where we are today. And we may say like, no, we haven't made much progress, but compared to back then we had, so it may not be in our lifetime, but as we continue to work with youth, as we continue to fight, I just want to encourage and empower everybody not to give up, because it may not be, we may not reap the benefits of that shade tree, but somebody else will. So let's continue to keep the end in mind and fight for what we believe in, fight for what's right. So those are my final words. If Kirk, you don't have anything, I'll go ahead and make an announcement in regards to our next session, which will take place on September 10th. It will be called Systemically Criminal. And we'll be discussing the criminalization of people of color on September 10th, same time, 6 p.m. On the Albert Wilson Foundation Facebook Live. So I appreciate you all, Adama. Like I said earlier, so nice to have you twice. So I appreciate your time. Nicole, I appreciate you joining us all the way from Capitol Hill and providing all your insight and your words. And Kirk, as always, appreciate your time. So if nothing else, appreciate everything and look forward to catching up with you all on the 10th.
All right.